Welcome to the program. We often don't know what era we're living in. We can only look backwards to see the big titanic changes that happened in our lives or in past lifetimes, and only in the future can we truly understand the marquee moments, the paradigm shifts of the past. However, it's widely assumed that we're living in an era of a paradigm shift around the world, a world that was focused around the United States as the sole major power that had all of the sway and all of the say in international affairs, to a more multipolar world where there is no longer one dominant force, but many smaller regional players. Well, if that's true, and we want to explore whether that's true or not, and if we are going to enter into a different era without a dominant geopolitical force in the world, how is that transition going to play out? What can we expect from that future world? How should we be thinking about it? What questions should we be asking? And no matter where we live in the world, what opportunities and risks does that kind of a change bring to us? Well, we couldn't think of anybody better than Professor Charles Kupchan to join us for this discussion. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Department of Government. From 2014 to 2017, Professor Kupchan served as a special assistant to the president and senior director of European affairs on the staff of the National Security Council in the Barack Obama administration. He was also director for European affairs on the National Security Council during the first Clinton administration. Before joining the Clinton NSC, he worked in the U.S. Department of State on the policy planning staff. Previously, he was an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. He is also a distinguished author with a number of books, including the 2001 Power in Transition, The Peaceful Change of International Order, which is a book that he co-authored, a book that he authored in 2002, The End of the American Era, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Geopolitics of the 21st Century, and a 2012 book, No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn. He's also a more recent author of the 2020 book, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. We are going to talk about all of the themes that were raised in all of those books, and those are not the only ones. He's written a number of others as well. But in this era of change, in this era of evolution, and in a time where many deep thinkers are publicly musing about whether we are living through the final days, or at least the final years, of the American empire and the beginning of something new with a rising power challenging a declining power, it's important for us to take a step back, reflect on the potential that we may not be living through that period, at least not yet, and that if we are, it may not be as simple as a major power handing the baton of global leadership to a new power, but perhaps an era where there truly are no major powers left, and it is only a group of regional actors that have to figure out how to interact with each other in this world. Professor Kupchan has spent a lot of his career deeply involved in these topics and issues, and so he brings a gravitas and a credibility to this topic that few others in academia, at least, and with practical government experience can bring to our listeners. So it is my honor to present to you my conversation with Professor Kupchan on the potential of the paradigm shift of geopolitics in our world in 2025. Professor, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you, Brian.
All right, so we're going to begin today with the 60,000-foot question of sort of where we are in the arc of history when it comes to rising powers, falling powers, emerging powers. You've written extensively on this for years. I'd love for you to give our audience your view on where we are in the American, let's call it the American empire for the sake of argument, and what you say to those who say America is at the end of its dominance, and we now have a rising power in Asia, namely China, that over time will overtake and replace the U.S. What is your reaction to those arguments, and where do you see us in this moment in history?
Well, I think the the world is passing through an inflection point, and that inflection point is the product of two tectonic shifts. One is a redistribution of global power on a scale that we have not seen in several hundred years. Power is shifting from west to east and from north to south. And as a consequence, the long era of Western domination that began really after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and first took the form of Pax Britannica and then Pax Americana, that period is coming to an end. I don't think we're about to get Pax Sinica, that is to say, a world order led by China. We're going to get no one's world. We're going to get a global landscape that isn't dominated by anybody. So it's not going to be a new American era or a new Chinese era or a new Asian era. It's simply going to be a bit of a free for all in which there is no clear center to global politics. And we know from history that that kind of world, what in political science we call a multipolar world, is going to be hard to manage because it's more unpredictable than either the unipolar world that we were living in after the Cold War or the bipolar world that we lived in during the Cold War. When you've got multiple poles of power out there, there's just more fluidity and more unpredictability. And then the second shift that we have, and I think very few people, certainly myself included, did not see this coming. I think we could have known and did know that there would be a diffusion of international power because no one stays at the top forever. What I think we didn't see coming was the degree to which we're experiencing a stumbling of liberal democracy, a moment at which the world's leading democracies, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, other major democracies, are experiencing a hollowing out of their political centers. And I think we know why this is happening. At least I have an explanation. And that is that the mode of production is changing. We're going from the industrial era to the digital era. And the social contract of the industrial era has gone bust. And so you now have a lot of Americans out there, particularly Americans who don't have a higher education, who are finding it hard to make ends meet. And as a consequence, they're unhappy. As a consequence, they're losing faith in the system. They feel that they have been left behind by globalization, and they are revolting. And so right now, I would say we're in this double whammy, if you will. The power is shifting away from the liberal democratic anchor, and democracy is weakening from the inside. And it's that internal weakening to liberal democracy that I think is most surprising. But when you add it all together, you end up with the following conclusion: that from the American Revolution and the French Revolution until a couple of decades ago, the arc of history was bending toward more freedom, more democracy, more justice. The world was becoming a nicer place. For the last couple of decades, that arc of history has bent in the other direction. The world is becoming less free. It's becoming less democratic. It's becoming more autocratic. And what we don't know is whether this is just a bit of a hiccup, a detour, and soon we're going to see the arc of history bend back in a direction of more democracy, more freedom, or whether this is the beginning of a new normal, which to some extent is going to constitute a fundamental backsliding in historical progress.
So that's a great setup. There's lots to explore there. Let's start with the concept of moving away from a unipolar world and into a multipolar world. Where do you believe those centers of gravity will be? Maybe where are they now? Where do you think that there will be more influence in some capitals than in others, if not a Washington centric world or a Europe centric world, where are those centers of gravity likely to emerge?
If you took just a kind of Polaroid, a snapshot of the world today, I think you would come to the conclusion that the next world is going to be bipolar. In fact, it's going to look a lot like the Cold War 2.0. And the United States and its buddies are going to be on one side, and Russia and China are going to be on the other side. And it will be democracy versus autocracy all over again. And I think that that's sort of where we are right now, largely as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's decision to back Russia. And you have seen mounting geopolitical rivalry between these two blocs over the last several years. The reason that I think the next world will be more multipolar rather than bipolar is that most of the rest of the world is not taking sides. Most of the rest of the world is telling both the West and Russia and China, we're not going to go on your team. We're not going to go on the other team. We are hedging our bets. And so all of what we call the global South, all of Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, they're all hedging their bets. In some ways, the country that is leading this new moment of agency, if you will, is India, where India is pursuing what it calls a multi-alignment grand strategy. What does that mean in practice? It means that one day Prime Minister Modi of India gets on a plane and he flies to Washington and he has a state dinner, the highest honor, with President Biden. And then he goes home, and a few weeks later, he has a summit with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And then in a few months later, he gets on a plane and he flies to Moscow and he hugs Putin. And then he goes home and calls the American president. This is the new world. And it's not just India that's playing the field, it's pretty much everybody, right? It's Brazil, it's Argentina, it's Turkey, it's South Africa, it's Nigeria. And so we see this kind of global awakening in which many countries that are coming up, climbing the ranks, are basically saying, we're tired of being the objects of great power politics. We want new agency. So there's this political awakening of sorts. And then you couple that with demographic facts, and you see a world that I think is much more multipolar and decentered than it is dominated by anybody. The real engines of growth in the coming decades are going to be South Asia, East Asia, Africa. That's where there are large young populations. The United States is going to do fine, but Europe is not. Russia is not. They have declining populations. And, just one quick factoid. Now, Europe ruled the world for the last several hundred years before the United States came along, literally ruled the world because it colonized most of it. By the end of this century, Europe will represent about 10% of global GDP. That gives you some sense of the scale of change.
So you have written in the past with others about these periods of transition, and that some of them, many of them, in fact, have been peaceful despite many major transitions not being. Is your assessment of this transformation that we're currently going through that it's more likely than not possible to get to that multipolar world with a peaceful, even if rocky path? Or do you believe some sort of conflict, whether it is anything like we've seen in the past or something new, is inevitable as we make this transition?
Judging from the past, I would say we in a heap of trouble. And that's because when you get these power transitions, you usually get war. And that's because number one doesn't like it when number 2 and 3 come along and say, move over. Furthermore, you have this hegemonic transition coinciding with this shift inside states from the industrial economy to the digital economy. And so there's a double location going on. And we've seen this before in the late 19th century, right? Pax Britannica lasts from roughly the beginning of the 19th century until German unification in 1871. And then we go from a world of European domination and British domination pretty quickly to a multipolar world because the United States industrializes, Japan industrializes. And inside, you're also going through a period of turmoil because you're going from the agricultural era to the industrial era, and it's causing a huge amount of socioeconomic turmoil and dislocation. What did we get? Lots of war. The wars of German unification, 3 in a row in the second half of the 19th century, then World War I, then World War II. So we know from history that when you combine rapid shifts in the global distribution of power with socioeconomic dislocations inside major powers, look out. That's what's happening today. The one thing that's new, and which I do think will be a source of stability, is nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons are in some ways very bad news because if we do have a great power war, it could be catastrophic. But they are good news in that they breed a considerable amount of caution. I would go so far to say that had the Cold War not occurred under the nuclear umbrella, the United States and the Soviet Union surely would have gone to war. Maybe over Vietnam, maybe over the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe over Berlin. But what kept us from going into a shooting war was fear of nuclear escalation. Today, if nuclear weapons didn't exist, I would put the likelihood of war between China and the United States, perhaps over Taiwan, at 90+%. Given the given the existence of nuclear weapons, I think the chance of war between China and the United States is considerably lower because both sides are scared that if you get into a shooting war, you don't know whether you can prevent it from escalating to the nuclear level. So I would put it this way. We're entering a bumpy historical era. We're entering a historical era fraught with the likelihood of war, but I'm cautiously optimistic that a combination of nuclear deterrence and good statecraft can help us orchestrate this transition peacefully.
So as we think about that potential, we'll take the optimistic potential. One of the challenges in that may be that while direct confrontation between major powers is the risk is less likely because of the nuclear capability, proxy wars seem like they'd be more likely. And one could argue that we are seeing those in other parts of the world. The direct principals may not be on the battlefield with each other, but through intermediaries, whether they are terrorist organizations in the Middle East, whether it's NATO funding and supporting the Ukrainians in the defense of their homeland, that sure, Russia and the Americans are not shooting at each other. Sure, the Iranians and the Americans are not shooting at each other, but there's a lot of players in between that are being funded to do some of the fighting for them to reshape those battlefields. So do you see in a multipolar world more of those kind, which is a harken back to the Cold War era of supporting these middle groups to fight on behalf of a larger force so that they don't have to confront each other?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are proxy wars going on, and there will be proxy wars going on because there will be competition between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia for sway in various parts of the world. The one that's going on right now that most, I would say, resembles a traditional proxy war is in Ukraine, where in many respects, Russia is saying this is our backyard, this is our traditional sphere of influence. We don't want NATO or the United States or other distant powers straying in to what is our backyard. Ukraine is saying we're done. We're not happy anymore living in the shadow of Moscow. Good night and good luck. We're heading to Europe. We're heading to NATO, and in many respects, this is a proxy war over in whose sphere of influence will Russia ultimately reside. I would say, it is probably the most dangerous war that we have seen. These most dangerous moments since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in some ways more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that, even though it occurred during the Cold War, was peace. There was peace, right? We are now in a situation in which bombs are dropping on Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine, probably as you and I speak. American forces and Polish forces aren't very far away from where those bombs are falling. And as a consequence, it's not inconceivable that these kinds of conflicts can escalate. That having been said, both the United States and its NATO partners and Russia have done a pretty good job of avoiding escalation. Some people say, well, Biden moved too slowly. Why didn't he send tanks on day one? Why didn't he send F 16s on day one? Why didn't he send long range missiles on day one? There's a very good answer, because he didn't want to go to war with Russia. And as a consequence, he was calibrating the kinds of weapons that we were giving to Ukraine so as to avoid escalation. And the Russians have threatened to use nuclear weapons, but been pretty careful not to take steps that would put their forces in direct conflict with NATO forces. So, yeah, we're going to see more wars of this kind, but at least so far, we have seen both the Russians and NATO take the necessary cautious steps to avoid escalation. And then in the case of the Middle East, what we've just seen is an Israeli operation with American help to prevent nuclear proliferation and to ensure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon.
So if I go back to the beginning of the 2000s, almost 25 years ago, I know at the time you were writing, including in one of your books, The End of the American Empire, you were foreshadowing the world we live in now in the US, where there was significant opposition in the US to the country's burdensome role as a global guardian, and those words couldn't be more prophetic about basically where the politics of the US went by the time we got to the 2016 election, and here we are in 2025. So you kind of saw this coming. You saw that the United States was getting tired of its role as the peacekeeper of the world, as the arbiter of affairs around the world, that the American public was getting tired of this role and would start to pull itself back. And yet, even as all the politics point in that direction, there's still the behaviors. I mean, the United States is still involved in every major conflict in the world, is still the center of gravity for economic policy and trade. The currency is still the dominant one in the world. And an American president that maybe ran on isolationism, is still supporting policies that have American forces, or at least American influence, heavily engaged, and has openly opined about wanting to have Americans expand its physical territory. So, how do you assess the politics of the American public today with words and politicians that advocate for this idea of isolationism, but an awful lot of actions that really don't match that and make it seem like America is as engaged internationally as it's ever been?
Well, Brian, I was in the U.S. government in the 1990s, soon after the end of the Cold War. And it was quite striking to me how quickly the American public lost interest in the rest of the world. Uh, Coverage of foreign affairs in the media, broadcast and print, nosedived. And I was working in the National Security Council in the White House, looking and watching President Clinton try to decide whether to get involved in the Balkans. As you recall, the Yugoslavia was falling apart in quite bloody fashion at the time, and there was great reluctance in the White House, in the Pentagon, in other quarters to do so. Eventually, the U.S. did engage, and there was a bombing campaign in Bosnia, and then in '99 in Kosovo to end the conflict there between largely a Serbian Yugoslav army and ethnic Albanians. But it was quite interesting to me, having grown up during the Cold War, when there was almost a taken for granted internationalism. That is to say, if there's a problem, America's going to send out the fire trucks, to an America where people were saying, well, wait a minute, is this our problem? Haven't we done enough in defeating the Soviet Union? Can't we have a respite and a peace dividend? And that experience led me to write a book called Isolationism, which was really a history of American grand strategy. And I have to say that when I started working on that book, I was quite struck by much of what I was reading, because the America that I saw pre-Pearl Harbor, pre-World War II, bore very little resemblance to the America that I grew up in as a kid and as an adult. And that kind of led me to ponder as to whether, the period from Pearl Harbor to today, is that the new normal, or is that the exception? And is the United States perhaps going to cycle back to a not necessarily an isolationist posture, because I don't think you can pull out of the world today in the same way that we did in the 19th century. But Trump's America First is really about that. It is in some ways an effort to go back to an American grand strategy that is much more protectionist, that is much more neo-isolationist, that is much more anti-immigrant than we've been for quite a long time. And it very much resembles the posture that the United States took during most of its history, really from the founding era until we entered World War II. But you're right to point out, Brian, that it's hard to pull out. Trump said, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine. We're going to stop the flow of weapons to Ukraine. And guess what? The war is going on, and Trump is coming around to the idea that the only way he's going to end this war is by sending more help to Ukraine. He was going to end the war in Gaza, and he did help get a ceasefire. But, now we have violence in Gaza, starvation in Gaza. And so, the world just won't play along. The world won't let the United States go. I still do believe that over time you are going to see an America that lightens its load. That is to say that the degree to which the United States is the protector of last resort, has the only reserve currency in the world, sends out the fire trucks whenever there's a problem. I think that era is gradually coming to an end, both because of the diffusion of power, but also because I think a lot of Americans are kind of fed up. And they're fed up in part for reasons of economic insecurity, and the degree to which they are saying, hey, why are we building schools in Afghanistan when we need them in Arkansas? But I also think they're fed up because the United States has made a lot of mistakes. And after 20 years of what we call the forever wars, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya cost $6 trillion, didn't produce a whole lot of good, I think many Americans are saying, hey, it's time to ease off and focus on the home front.
And at the same time, in doing so, one could argue that some of the policies of the second Trump administration, at least if we look at the Western Hemisphere, is meant to, whether it will or not, to consolidate America's position, whether it's to intentionally weaken its neighbors and the South American and Central American countries, or whether it's to bully them and push them into positions where the U.S.'s policy is my way or the highway. This doesn't feel like a country turning in and looking upon itself and just focusing on itself. It actually seems like a country that wants an even bigger role to tell others what to do, assuming that what they want is what's best for the U.S. That seems to conflict with the politics of, hey, let's just focus on the homeland and not worry about anybody else. But at the same time, let's make ourselves even bigger and stronger and more powerful and more hard to deal with. I'm curious how you look at that. Is there a parallel, maybe, in whether it's American history or global history, where there was a country that maybe the body politic wanted to look more inward, but the net policies was to actually make the country more of a player in international affairs?
Well, I do think that you are to some extent putting your finger on a conversation, a debate that's taking place in the United States that we've been having from the very beginning. And the U.S., particularly beginning in the 1940s, has had a very conflicted view of its role in the world, because from the very beginning there was a version of American exceptionalism that said we have to go out and change the world. Right? It was Thomas Paine who said we can begin the world all over again. And so the United States anointed itself early on as a country that would blaze a new path and spread democracy. And so that we've had that bug in our bonnet for quite a while. And as a consequence, there have been constant decisions about the nation's role in the world. And I think you've seen an evolution in that role, and in it kind of in the following phases. Until 1898, the basic rule was set by George Washington, and that was commercial relations with everyone, political connections to no one. And that really was the era in which the United States focused heavily on the mothership, on expanding westward, making it to the Pacific Ocean, and stopping there. But incidentally, because I'll come back to your question, we tried several times to invade and annex Canada. And we were interested at the end of the Civil War in buying Greenland. And in fact, started looking at that. And then at the same time, started talking about building the Panama Canal, which didn't happen until after the turn of the century. But this was all percolating in the 19th century. And then after 1898, the United States went from being a country focused very much on North America to a country that made good on the Monroe Doctrine, which was we want to be the master of the Western Hemisphere. And that really kind of was the guiding rule of thumb until World War II, with a little hiatus in World War I, which didn't go over very well. Even though the United States was on the winning side, there was a public reaction against the United States getting involved in World War I, and we retreat back to hemispheric isolation. But in some ways, I think what you're seeing now is that Trump, if Trump could have his way, I think he would take us back to a world in which the United States was the master of its hemisphere and disentangled itself from the rest of the world. I think he'd like to get out of Europe. I think he'd like to get out of Japan, like to get out of South Korea. He looks at these, he says, we need these like a hole in the head. And that he's looking at a map. This guy's a real estate developer. And he says, ooh, there's Canada, there's Greenland, there's the Panama Canal. I want those. That's good property. Problem is, number one, it's very hard to pull out of Europe, and it's very hard to pull out of Asia when you have aggressive states in China and Russia. And number two, during the 19th century, there really was such a thing as natural security. We had big oceans to the east and west, small neighbors to the north and south. We could, in some ways, detach ourselves from the world and live happily. Very hard to detach oneself in a world that is globalized and interdependent and tethered together. And that's, I think, a good way to think about Trump. He'd love to just kind of pack up, pull up the drawbridge, but he finds it extremely difficult to do so. And that's, I think, why we see him change every 15 minutes when it comes to what role he thinks the United States should play in the world.
So when you think about a topic you brought up at the very top of the interview about liberal democracy, this was one of the things that separated the United States, Western European countries from all of the others that we've talked about in this program. The more autocratic leaders in China, Russia, North Korea, the more theocratic leaders of the Middle East, the more strongman leaders in Africa, the populists of Latin America. This really separated. In recent times, we're seeing a questioning of that. I don't know that people use the words liberal democracy per se in questioning it, but they're questioning the elements of that in the United States and some places in Europe as well. Do you see, as part of the general trajectory towards a multipolar world, a rethinking of the ideologies in places like the US, like Western Europe, about the role liberal democracy will play and the role they will play as guardians of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that the game is on when it comes to whether the world is going to become more autocratic or more democratic. And that's kind of new. As I said, there used to be a sense that everything was moving in the right direction. That is to say, the arc of history was bending toward more democracy, even if slowly. And now you can't say that, right? I think you really have to admit that it's game on. At this point, we just don't know. And I think part of the reason that we don't know is that if you are a developing country, let's say in Africa, and you're looking out at the world and you're saying, what model do we want to follow? The answer is not necessarily the democratic model. And that's because the democratic model right now is underperforming. Right? We in this country, in the UK, in France, democratic institutions are not really delivering what the electorate wants. And that's one of the main reasons that you are seeing such disaffection and distrust in democratic institutions. And in the meantime, China, precisely because it doesn't have democratic institutions and a Congress, looks like it's pretty good. Looks like it's able to deliver for its citizens. It's brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Yeah, it's made mistakes. And right now, the Chinese economy is facing some trouble. But if you're out there looking at these competing models, it's no longer a slam dunk that democracy outperforms the alternatives. And that's because right now it isn't. I still think that democracy has a leg up on all the other alternatives, and that is that there is a human desire for dignity and for autonomy and respect, and democracy is the only system that fulfills that desire. But I do think that we have to figure out how to make sure that in liberal democracies, governments are delivering the goods. And that means, in the case of this country, getting working Americans back up on their feet. In the case of the UK, getting working Brits back up on their feet. That to me is the top priority, because I think that America rose to being a great power on the backs of political centrism, on the back of the rise of the middle class. And we've now seen that middle class hollow out. We've seen the political center hollow out. The country is now polarized. When power shifts hands in Washington, you see radical swings in foreign policy. You can't conduct a country that way. And so I think you got to rebuild the United States from the inside out. And that ultimately is a task that requires figuring out the future of work in the digital age. Right now, I think our leadership is kidding itself. That is to say, if Trump thinks that he can put X% tariffs on the EU, X% on China, X% on India, X% on Japan, and suddenly Americans are all going to be building air conditioners and refrigerators again and making $80 an hour, he's kidding himself. Bottom line is that 80 to 85% of Americans are now in the service sector. They're not going back to building cars, air conditioners, and refrigerators. And we need to have a conversation about the future of work in the digital age. What are people going to do to earn a living wage? And it's going to get worse before it gets better, because as AI kicks in, the people that are now driving Ubers and driving trucks and working in Amazon fulfillment centers, they're probably going to lose their jobs. So this to me is an urgent conversation. And also, I think in some respects, the $6 million question to getting liberal democracies back up on their feet. Rebuild the middle class, rebuild the economic model, fashion a social contract for the digital age. I'm confident that liberal democracies are again going to sprint to the head of the pack and be at the vanguard of history. We don't address those issues, I think we're in a lot of trouble, and autocracy may ultimately win out.
So let's go back to that topic of economic revolutions influencing political revolutions and therefore the geopolitical order. So you've just eloquently stated some of the economic realities facing the world already, and automation and AI and machine learning and quantum computing are all just accelerating even faster. Do you believe there is a chance that one of the alternative forms of government can actually use these tools to accelerate their own repression of people in their countries and potentially in other countries, and almost use it as a cheat code to expand an autocratic version of governance, because the liberal democracies of the world are moving too slow? And even though they might have the better vision for people, they're the very thing that makes them a liberal democracy, a more slow, methodical way of approaching these things, loses out, and technology gets in the hands of another form of government that is able to use it to advance their own means. Am I oversimplifying that threat?
No, uh, and it's the here and now, right? This is not theoretical. If you were to say, what is one of the significant sources of China's and Russia's ability to maintain their tight grip on power, it's the fact that they have used social media to propagate a particular narrative, a particular political identity that works and that sustains solidarity, and it sustains in China support for one party rule, and it sustains Putin's narrative about the war in Ukraine. They don't allow the same free for all in social media and in mainstream media that we do. And here in the United States, there is no reality. right? There are competing versions of reality that, in many respects, do not overlap. And as a consequence, deliberative democracy is stumbling because there aren't shared facts. How can you have deliberate democracy when people have very different views about 1 plus 1 and 2 plus 2 and 3 plus 3? And part of the problem here is that the kind of explosion in social media and the lack of regulation of social media and of technology companies and of AI means that it is the kind of wild, wild west. And so I think we're already in a world in which those countries that are willing to exercise tighter control over the flow of information, including digital platforms, are for now having an easier time of it. Now, ultimately, that may hold them back because their societies may stymie innovation. Their societies may not have the same vitality that we do here in the West. But I do think that we have to have a rethink about the flows of information and about how to manage the development and the deployment of AI in a way that works to the advantage of American democracy as opposed to undermining American democracy.
So you've also written quite a bit about the foundations of what allowed countries like the United States and before the United States, Western European empires to rise above after centuries in which the center of gravity in the world was in places like the Middle East or Asia or elsewhere. Is there anything foundational that allowed Western Europe and the United States to take their place as the preeminent players in the world, and now with the US as the dominant player in the world? Is there anything foundational that you think would actually continue to give places like the US a strategic advantage going forward against any of the other potential rivals in the world? Some argue, look, the rule of law is critical to this. Powerful institutions that allow people an outlet to have a say in their government is critical to it, that these are foundational to why there's stability in these countries and make them places to invest. So do you believe that if those things are upheld, that places like the US and Europe can continue to maintain their strong place in the world? Or do you think those are things that can be copied anywhere, anytime, and there may be other elements that allow other forms of government to get to a similar place of power, economically, socially, geopolitically, militarily?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough question. You know, when I think about the period from 1700 to 1800, that's really when the pendulum swung from a global economy centered on China and India. They together represented about half of global GDP, to a global economy dominated by Northwestern Europe, right? The key changes there were really the loosening of the grip of monarchy and church, right? The rise of the middle class, the growth of education, and the empowerment of common people that overthrew those traditional institutions of government and allowed innovation and allowed free enterprise and allowed scientific research. You know, by the late 1800s, thousands and thousands of books were being published in Europe. A handful of books were being published in more autocratic societies. And so, in some ways, the key was that Europe and then the United States, they sort of mastered the transition to the industrial era and to the era of liberal democracy. And I do think that those attributes will remain critical, that the pluralism, the fleet-footedness, the rule of law, the importance of private enterprise and free markets, those will, I think, enable the United States and other liberal democracies to continue to prosper, as long as we figure out how to make that transition to the digital age and figure out the future of work in the digital age. And I think we will, right? Getting from the agricultural era to the industrial era was no mean feat. It took a lot of hard work and it took a lot of dislocation, but we got there. And so I think we will also master this transition. But I don't believe that the that this will enable the United States and its partners to continue to stay at the top of the heap. And that's simply because we are seeing a country like China hold its own. Not just hold its own, but if you look at critical areas of technology, solar panels, drones, electric batteries and electric vehicles, Alipay and digital payment systems. I could go on. China is either the dominant player or has a high-tech sector in those areas that rivals, and in some cases bests, the United States and what Silicon Valley can produce. And so we have peer competitors out there. And if you look at India and you look at Southeast Asia, they're moving quickly into the digital world. And so I do think that even if we do well, even if we prosper, even if we figure out how to take advantage of these new technologies, it's going to be a much more level playing field than we are used to. And I think one of the changes in the American mindset that we're going to have to grapple with is accepting that world, because Americans are used to being at the top of the heap. And we may stay at the top of the heap, right? It may well be that China never catches up with the United States and India never catches up in the United States, but they're going to come awful close. And as a consequence, figuring out how to work with other major powers that are peer competitors and that on one day are going to do better than we are, the next day we're going to do better than they are. But it's a very different kind of global environment than the one that we've been living in since the United States came online as a great power. That's going to take a leap of imagination. And I do think that if Americans feel that they need to stay number one, if the preservation of primacy remains an animating national mission, it's not going to work. We will peacefully manage and anchor this transition to the next world only by helping create the space for China, for India, for Brazil, for Turkey, for South Africa, for other powers to feel like they are stakeholders in the international system. And so I do think that in many respects, I'm hopeful and in fact confident that the United States will remain the anchor. But instead of aiming to preserve primacy, we're going to have to aim to be one of many that are coming together to try to provide governance in a world that is multipolar, but still very globalized and interdependent.
I'm curious specifically about China. I feel like you get a wide range of and frankly well-informed opinions about where China's trajectory will take them. You listen to some analysts and they say, look, the demographics are hopeless. At a certain period of time, they're going to fall off that cliff. They're going to hit a roadblock in their economic growth. They're never going to achieve their full potential for all those reasons. And then you hear others who say, well, demographics notwithstanding, they still have innovation in their society. They still have advantages that other places don't have. They'll have alternatives to the United States in a new environment. They will still be able to achieve that. I'm curious which side of that argument you fall on. Are you one who believes that the China rise is overhyped, or do you think that in fact it's a great society, it has a great history, it has a great future, and we should just expect them to be one of the top 3 to 4 rivals in the world to the U.S.?
I would say I shade in the direction of being bullish on China in the sense that, yeah, they have a demographic problem, but they also have 1.4 billion people. right? We've got 330 million. So even if their population shrinks, they got a lot of people there, and a lot of them are going to universities, and a lot of them are getting trained in engineering and computer science and other kinds of fields that will enable them to continue to innovate. On the other hand, is China 10 feet tall? Are they going to eat us for lunch? Absolutely not. But if you have to say, are they pretty good at what they do? Are they going to be able to hold their own? Have they been able to make the move from a country that was primarily an industrial power to a country that also is a knowledge economy? Yeah, they've done it. They've pulled it off. Are their problems all that much more grave than our problems? No, I would say that they're comparable. And so, if the question is, are they going to overtake the United States? Are they going to leave us in the dust? I would say no. But if the question is, are they going to be a peer competitor? Are they going to be able to produce technologies and gradually expand their influence in the world? The answer is yes. And the other piece of this is that, does China pose a threat to the United States? Sure, they do. Right? They're hacking into our systems. They're expanding in the South China Sea in a way that's illegal, threatening their neighbors. But I'm not someone who loses a lot of sleep at night fearing that the Chinese are trying to take over the world. And so I think we need to have a sober and realistic debate about the nature of the Chinese threat. What can we allow? What should we not allow? Because I do think that American politics has overheated when it comes to the China threat. There's very little bipartisanship in the United States. The one thing you can get Democrats and Republicans to agree about is the China threat. And as a consequence, Democrats and Republicans alike kind of overhype it. Right? The best anecdote that comes to my mind is that, a balloon floats across the United States and we kind of go crazy and are shooting it down with F-16s and shooting down other balloons. And it just kind of showed you the degree to which a certain hysteria breaks out over China. So I think that China poses a threat. Yes, we need to have a conversation about what kinds of Chinese behavior are acceptable, what kinds are not acceptable. But we also have to figure out a way to work with them. Because when you have a country as big as China, a country as big as the United States, and a world that is interdependent and globalized, number one and number two need to find a way to get on with each other.
And the last region I'll just ask about quickly is Europe. There was a time as the European Union came together, as the euro was introduced, where it was widely assumed that this new economic force would be able to at least challenge the United States, potentially rival it. Certainly a very large economy, a very dynamic economy. But as we record today in 2025, it's a continent that, in the absence of the US support, wouldn't even be able to really support Ukraine all that much in pushing back a Russian invasion, other than to be able to supply some weapons and obviously political support. But in the absence of US weaponry and other economic support, really would not be in a great position. I'm curious where you see Europe as a body going in an era where nationalism seems to be pulling nations apart, not bringing them together.
Well, I would say that Europe is in some ways one of the great magical accomplishments of the 20th century, in the sense that the European Union has succeeded in building a zone of peace. Right? And you and I can now drive from Germany to France and you're not going to see tanks, and you're not going to see border guards. You might see some sheep. That's about it. And that's a miracle, right? Because that's a border along which there has been centuries and centuries of bloodshed. And the European Union has successfully eradicated geopolitical competition among its members. That having been said, Europe does punch below its weight. Europe underinvested in geopolitics, in part because it believed that it had made it to the other side of history. It had left geopolitics behind, and now everyone could focus on other things. And then all of a sudden, Ukraine has invaded Russia. If you live in Germany and Poland, you now live with existential fear because the biggest war since World War II is raging not very far from your borders. And so we're seeing Europe turn the corner, right? The last NATO summit, Europeans agreed to spend 5% of GDP on defense, including infrastructure. That's a lot, right? That's because, they've been spending around 1, 1.2, 1.3. Then they agreed to 2. Now they've agreed to 5. Is this going to turn things around overnight? No. It will take quite a while before you see the results of investment. And the one other comment I'd make here, Brian, is that Europe is experiencing the same kind of nationalist backlash that we're seeing here, right? The political centers in Europe are also eroding, and the ascendant political forces are populist, right wing, anti Europe. And one needs to kind of wait and see what happens in France and Germany. If in the next French election, the National Rally wins, which is a far right party, that could really gum up the project of European integration, make it harder for Europe to come together on defense. So I would just, so far Europe has done an amazing job of building a union at peace, a prosperous union at peace. But like events here on this side of the Atlantic, we are living through a moment of uncertainty. Here in the United States, for now, the center has not held, and it needs to be rebuilt. On the other side of the Atlantic, the center has held, but it's shrinking. And I just don't know whether it will rebound or whether it will continue shrinking and end up in a boat similar to the United States, deep political polarization and dysfunction. But that's why I would come back to this point I made about the future of work in the digital age. This is in some ways what's needed to rebuild our middle classes, to rebuild our political centers, and to get liberal democracy back up on its feet. This is an urgent project, and in some ways, I think the foundation to ensuring that the United States and its democratic partners have their lights on at a time of great uncertainty and great instability in the international system. The world needs American leadership, smart, steady leadership. That's not what they're getting right now.
So, as we conclude, I think one thing that would be fascinating, especially for our international audience, to hear your take on, if we look ahead, we're going to assume that there's no shenanigans, that in fact we do have term limits in the U.S. and there will be a new president elected in 2028. And there are plenty of people who have desires and designs on being a future president of the United States. If one of those candidates, regardless of party, came to you for your counsel and advice, given everything we've talked about today, and they said, "Professor, I would love, your counsel, your guidance on what's the most important thing that the United States should focus on in a next administration, given this likely move to a multipolar world," what would you counsel that person from a purely policy, no politics in this, just from a pure policy perspective, looking at the arc of history, thinking about economics, thinking about societal, what would you want them to focus on?
I would I would say that the most important thing to focus on is the home front, in the sense that what most worries me, what keeps me up at night, what is the greatest threat to the United States and to the West right now? It's not Xi Jinping. It's not Vladimir Putin. It is not an Ayatollah here or an extremist there. It's us. It is the prospect uh, of this great experiment in liberal democracy either failing or stumbling for generations to come. And we've seen in various countries, Turkey would be an example, Hungary another example, whereby little by little, liberal democracy slips into something that looks more like what's called a competitive autocracy or illiberal populism. And I don't think we're going to go down that road. I think American institutions are strong and that they will survive. But when I look out at what's happening on a daily basis here in the United States, I find American politics unrecognizable. And as a consequence, for me, the first, second, and third, fourth, fifth priorities are getting America's house in order, rebuilding the strength of its liberal democratic institutions, figuring out the future of work in the digital age, figuring out what kinds of policies we need to regulate the deployment and development of AI, which will be central politically, socioeconomically, in terms of American foreign policy. And if we figure that out, we can serve as a model for others to go down that road. But it seems to me that getting the United States back up to its better self, getting the United States back up to being the kind of leader that others look to, is in my mind the most important task.
A very optimistic note to end the program on. Professor, thank you for your time. You've been very generous with our audience today. If folks would like to learn more about you or follow your work, is there a website or any place that you routinely post updates or anything that we can promote for you?
Um, I'm not as active on social media and websites as I should be. But if you go to cfr.org, Council on Foreign Relations.org, I think there are various links to articles that I've written. And anybody that would like to is also free to email me at Kupchan, Kupchan @cfr.org. I do have a Twitter account because I was told that I should. And my Twitter handle is at Charles Kupchan. I don't tweet all that often, but I do have an account, Brian, because I wanted to fulfill my obligations. But I'm easy to find.
Very well. And we'll post links to that in the description of this podcast. Professor, thank you very much for joining the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Brian.
There was one fundamental assumption that underpinned the entire episode you just listened to. The fundamental assumption was that we are coming upon the end of a unipolar world with the United States as the center of geopolitical gravity. And that change, whatever comes next, will happen relatively soon. Perhaps it's still years, maybe a decade or more away. And so what we discussed was what comes next. Is there another singular geopolitical force in the world that will simply take the baton? Or do we transition to a world with many different centers of gravity in different dimensions? And we also discussed whether that can be done peacefully over these next many years, or if it will be done through violence and warfare. But I think it's important in a program like this that we challenge assumptions. And so I don't have enough of an expert view to really offer a definitive perspective that is anywhere near on par with the expertise of Professor Kupchan and the perspective that he shared with you all. But what I can do is to help challenge your thinking even further. So let's challenge the assumption as you think about and digest the episode you just listened to. Number one, what if the end of the American dominance and empire is not upon us? What if there's another 100 years to go? And what if the handoff we're talking about doesn't happen for another many decades? How does that change the potential answer to the questions about whether it will be done peacefully or not, and whether it will be a singular power in the future or many? The other extreme to challenge the underlying assumption is, what if it happens suddenly? What if the United States careens out of control and breaks apart, much like the Soviet Union did in its final days? What does that mean for the world and how the transition would take place and what it would look like? So I don't feel qualified to say whether I think any of those things will happen, but I am qualified to ask the questions, and I will continue to ask those of great guests that we bring on this program. So I ask you to go back and listen to this episode, and by just changing the underlying assumption, how would your answers differ? How would the answers of smart people in your life differ? The same questions would still be true. Do we think we can transition peacefully? Do we think it would be a transition to a singular force in the future or many forces? And how does just changing the timeline change our answers? Hopefully that little extra perspective makes this episode even richer and more mentally stimulating for you. And as you bring those conversations to your circles, challenge their assumptions. Challenge your own assumptions. And if nothing else, you'll be less likely to be surprised with whatever comes next. As always, I thank you all for listening. If you'd like to hear more programs like this, simply subscribe to this podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. You can go to brianjmatos.com to find links to all of your favorite podcast platforms where you can subscribe. You can also find me on YouTube, where I post exclusive clips where I answer your questions only and exclusively on the YouTube channel. Just search Brian J. Matos on YouTube. You'll find me, and please subscribe to that channel as well as subscribing to my core podcast. And if you'd like to reach out to me with questions or you have reactions to this show, simply email me, info@brianjmatos.com. I personally read all my messages, I respond to them, and sometimes I bring them on the air to answer them. Thank you all for listening. Look forward to the next episode. And in the meantime, I encourage you all to stay curious.